Okay, welcome to this seminar, which we have chosen to call Women's Power to Stop War. As you can see on the red t-shirts all around the room. We who arranged this are the Malmö Lund local section of the Swedish section of WILF, which is Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. We are a 99-year-old women's and feminist peace organization. Started out to try and stop the First World War, and we've been trying to butt in wherever we can since then and provide feminist analysis of war and peace. Such work can sometimes feel as though it's very distant from our lives, that we talk about the UN or countries where war is currently going on, that it might be far away in the Middle East or far away in Africa or far away in South America. But being Swedes here, we know that we also export a lot of weapons, we produce a lot of weapons, we design a lot of weapons. And so we actually contribute here to produce war, which makes it a question that is very, very pertinent for us here. And so we're going to talk a bit about war and peace and militarism and militarization on the basis of who we are and where we are today. And I am very happy to have Cynthia Enlow with me, who I assume many of you know.
Militarism, I think, is very sneaky because it's a set of ideas, it's a way of looking at the world that can really insinuate itself into the way you live, into the way you see the world, in the way you decide what you're afraid of, the way you decide what you're proud of, the way you decide what makes you feel secure. And all those things are not about what's happening over there. They are really about yourself and how you relate to people and what you aspire to for your own country or for yourself. And that means that trying to understand militarism is not about being a foreign policy expert. I'm very actually suspicious of expertise. You can be a specialist, right? Which means that's the thing you really think about a lot, right? You try to investigate, you try to keep track of. So being a specialist, to me, just says, you know what? I give a lot of thought to this. I pay attention to this. Being expert always sounds as though, well, here we are on a little stage, but anyway, but it sounds as though you are up above lecturing to people. And militarism really takes a lot of attention to yourself and attention to others. So here are some of the hallmarks of militarism. It's a way of looking at the world. So one of the hallmarks of militarism, and you may not be a full-blown militarist when you begin to adopt this. And we were talking a bit about this yesterday out at the forum. So if some of you are there, you've heard me say this, but the first thing is sort of, what do you think human nature is like? What do you think human nature is like? If you think that humans, including yourselves, are really basically, that's always the term used, basically, right? If you think basically that humans are selfish, that's just human nature, right? That's always the phrase used, that's just human nature. That human beings are self-centered, that human beings are competitive. If that's one of the things you just believe, right? It doesn't make you a bad person to believe that, but that's just one of the ways you think it makes sense to understand the world. That doesn't make you a militarist, but it's the first step towards being militarized. And the way to think about that is to think, well, what's the alternative to that belief? Even if you don't believe it, what's the alternative? What's the alternative to that? That common sense notion that, well, you just have to understand that human beings are just self-centered creatures. Anyone? I mean, what's the alternative to that? Yeah.
Well, we've been socialized into be that competitive, and so it's constant.
So it doesn't have to be.
It doesn't, yes.
We can be cooperative. Maybe the most basic element of human nature is cooperation, is generosity, is altruism, right? So one of the ways to realize what your own belief is to even if you don't believe it, try to imagine an alternative belief, right? Because beliefs are things you learn. A second building block or step towards being militarized is to think that the world is a dangerous place. Now, this is one of the most common things that is said by experts, all right? By people who get on, pardon the expression, television and, say, well, now we all know, and this is particularly since 9/11, but this kind of thinking about the world has been out there for a long time. And that is, well, we all know, as if we all did know this, we all know that the world is a dangerous place. Adopting that plus humans are basically selfish and self-centered and competitive, put those things together, and the door has just creaked open a bit in your life to becoming militarized. Those two beliefs. The world, because what's the other way to think about the world? The world. It's full of people who care about each other. It's full of possibility for creativity, right? Because it's a sweeping generalization to say, it's one thing to say, of course there are dangers in the world, right? Don't try to climb Mount Everest without a trained Sherpa, who are now all on strike, in case you didn't know, because they're underpaid and exploited. So definitely don't try to climb Mount Everest this week, right? But so there are dangers, but that's very different than saying the world is a dangerous place as a kind of starting point for making sense of the world. A third idea that moves you along the road towards becoming militarized is that every country needs a military. Needs, that's the key word there. Every country needs a military. And the continuation of that is, therefore, any country that doesn't have a military is naive. And no country wants to be seen as naive. So, what's your nearest neighbor without a military? Oh, come on. It's not that early in the morning. I just heard
Iceland.
Iceland, of course. Icelanders have chosen not to have a military, right? What's another country that whose people have chosen not to have a military? Costa Rica. In 1948, Costa Ricans decided that they were constantly at war, and they were called the soccer wars. There was even a soccer match with El Salvador could set off a border war. And so Costa Ricans wrote a new, it's not this easy, right? But this is the shorthand. Costa Ricans wrote a new constitution, and they decided, now think about how radical this is, and think about whether Swedes and Danes and Norwegians also did the same. They wrote a new constitution, and here was the idea underneath the new constitution. The idea was, if we don't have a military, we won't go to war so much. I mean, can you imagine introducing this to the US Congress? I mean, truly. But imagine introducing it to the Swedish Parliament. Let's revise the Swedish Constitution on the basis of this new idea that we've imported from Costa Rica and from Iceland. That if we did away with our military, we wouldn't go to war so much. The reason that most countries think most people in most countries think that sounds absolutely bizarre, right, is because they've adopted as common sense that you've got to have a military, not just for protection, but to be a real country, to be a real nation, to be a respected state. So that's a very widespread idea that having a military makes a country look like it's a grown-up, makes it look like it's a player, makes it look like it belongs in the pantheon of respected states in the international community. Okay, keep on going now. Are you making a checklist of how many things of these things you believe? Make your own check. You know, we have checklists like, can you tell if you're a feminist, right? You believe this. Okay, try to figure out how militarized you are, right? And I'm not giving the full list, so you have, back in our discussion, we can think about the full list. Gender, of course, plays a really important part in adopting militarized ideas. One of the key ideas, and most governments depend on it, especially if they've given up conscription, right? Male conscription. And that is that becoming a soldier for the state helps a man, a boy, become a man, helps the maturity process for a male human being. Having been a soldier is one way to have grown up, to have become an adult. Just like a state needs a military to be mature, many young men need to have military experience to gain maturity. The governments around the world that have kept their militaries need most of us to think that, and they really need women as mothers to think it. They really depend on mothers believing that their sons joining the military, either giving in to conscription or voluntarily taking part in soldiering, they need mothers to believe that that will help them in their mothering. That will help them make their sons become mature, responsible, disciplined human beings. They also need girlfriends and wives to respect men in uniform, to really see that a man in uniform, in the military's uniform, is a man worthy of respect, is probably a trustworthy man, is probably a very mature man, is probably somebody who understands the world. So they need not just mothers, they need girlfriends and wives to also adopt the idea that a man who has gone through military experience is a man that's worthy of respect. Take away the girlfriend factor, and it is much harder for governments to recruit soldiers. Where are we on the list here? We're up to about 5, 6. There's also the understanding that in the militarism package, because you notice it's a package. It's not that you have one idea that makes you a militarist. It's that you adopt one idea, and then you become convinced of the next idea, and then along the way, something in your life makes you think that the next idea also makes sense. You become militarized over time. It doesn't happen all on one morning. The other idea is that it is natural, always in quotes, right? Feminists always put natural in quotes, don't they? Right? You know, when you're speaking to most of you are feminists, when you're speaking as a feminist, don't you find yourself always you're just doing this all the time, right? And the reason feminists are always doing this, right, putting quotes around words, is because we've learned that almost everything that everyone else tells us is natural has in fact been made up, right? And that's a very radical idea, and people don't like it, right? You put quotes around security, then you put quotes around patriotism, then you put quotes around modern, you put quotes around everything, right? And you do it, we all do it, we've all learned how to do it, because we want to open up the conversation. We want to say, you know that idea that you just think is, quote, natural? Actually, let's talk about it. How'd you ever learn that, right? So the idea that the world is made up of enemies is also something that has to be learned. And I remember a friend of mine, this is, as you know, I'm from the US, and this was, I don't know, I must have been maybe 22, 23. And I grew up in New York, and of course I grew up with many racist ideas and presumptions swirling around me. But here's one I didn't have. And so I had to be taught. So I moved to Boston, and I remember an older friend of mine said one day, she said, well, something about a coworker. And I said, oh, what do you mean? She said, well, you can tell that she's Irish. I thought, gosh, no, I didn't. That's a skill I haven't developed yet. But the thing is, what she wanted to do, she wanted to teach me that I could tell that somebody was Irish. Well, Boston has a long history of racism towards people identified as Irish, right? Some of the strongest racist policies, as well as cultural presumptions, are by alleged Anglo heritage people towards people who are, quote, Irish. So here she was, this was in the 1960s, trying to teach me, a naive New Yorker, a racist skill that I hadn't yet developed, right? I probably had developed lots of other, racist ideas, but there was one that I needed to catch up on, right? To really be able to operate in the Boston area. And I was on a bus once, this was during the Yugoslav War, and I was on a bus once with a group of Croatians, and we were driving down into Krajina, which was one of the contested peninsula areas, for those of you who know Croatia. And the Croatian military had just driven out you have to keep track of Yugoslavia. Had just driven out the Serbs, right? And this fellow on the bus said something about, it was about a doll. He was going to deliver a doll as a gift or something. He said, I know the doll looks Croatian. I looked at this doll, and I thought, I don't know. And then again, he tried to teach me, right? I was somebody who had not yet developed this racist skill that I could tell a Croatian from a Serb this is a toy, right? In this doll. And all those learning skills are part of building the notion of who you can trust and who you cannot trust. And that's part of becoming militarized, is learning, and it's because it's a learning, right? All learning is not good, right? You could be educated into things you should not want to be educated in. And you should watch it when people try to educate you in something that you should not be educated in, and you should resist that learning, right? Which takes another kind of learning. But to build distrust, to think that the world is a dangerous place because there are certain people that you must never trust, is part of becoming militarized. For women to become militarized, you must not only admire men who've been soldiers, You must also be grateful for men to be your protectors. One of the deepest gendered ideas in militarism is that in any society, or in any family, or in any community, there are the protected and the protectors. The protectors are masculinized. When I say masculinized, not all men measure up to being real protectors. It's a way to measure masculinity amongst men. Okay? All women, if they are true women, are not only willing to be protected, and this is really important for the feminization of militarism, women must be grateful for being protected. So, I'll stop this point on the checklist. Maybe we can add other things. But there are two things. Militarism has to be learned, and therefore you can resist the learning, and you can think of other alternative ideas and values. But the second thing is, it happens usually not overnight. It usually happens as you're growing up. It doesn't stop when you're 20 or 25 or 30 or 35. You can have not been very militarized and then in your 40s become very militarized. And the second thing about militarism is that it is deeply dependent on ideas about masculinity and ideas about femininity. And that's one of the reasons that becoming a feminist doesn't guarantee that you won't be militarized, but it definitely inoculates you against easy militarization. So let's take it from there and see where we're going with this.
Thank you very much.